I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, but I started my career as a high school English teacher. And I'm here today to talk about something I'm passionate about, which is helping people learn to teach, and particularly learning to teach in a time when things are changing quickly. So as we heard this morning, the pace of change is only accelerating. So one of the questions we face as teachers is, how do we prepare our students for a faster future? How do we think about how to develop the kinds of skills and mindsets in our students that will help them be successful in a future that we can't yet anticipate? We don't yet know what the jobs of the future will bring, but we do know that whatever they are, it will require young people to develop a great deal of flexibility, an ability to know how to learn and how to adapt what they know to new situations, the ability to collaborate with one another and work together across diverse backgrounds and knowledge to solve complex problems. So in that faster future, a lot of what we're talking about recalls, and we heard it this morning, a class of pedagogy that's related to project-based learning. Project-based learning isn't a new idea. We've tried it before, and it is a kind of teaching that puts students at the center. It involves students actively in their learning, and it goes in the United States by a family of names: deeper learning, project-based learning, personalized learning. These are all related forms of teaching that emphasize the learning of rich content, learning to think critically, working collaboratively, communicating, all of the skills that we were just talking about. It doesn't leave knowledge behind, but it adds an additional set of skills and puts the emphasis on learning something deeply. And in the case of project-based learning, much of that is done around a project, where a project becomes the context for that learning, collaboration, and communication. The idea is that you will learn these skills and the knowledge through engaging in a rich, content-rich project. So all of these forms of teaching have certain things in common. They all support student agency and ownership over their own learning. They take, as we heard this morning, they move from putting students in a passive position, receiving knowledge, to being more active, to being much more actively involved. There's an emphasis, again, on different kinds of thinking and developing those, what are sometimes called 21st century skills. And the hope is always to blend the rigorous content and the skills through a variety of assignments. So, as I said, these aren't new. We've tried them before, and we get very excited about them because of all their potential. But often, these forms of teaching don't last. And I would argue the reason that we keep going on a pendulum from student-centered to more teacher-centered is this kind of teaching is very difficult. And we don't do enough to really prepare teachers for the demands of student-centered learning. It's not enough to step aside and let students learn. There's a lot of work that teachers need to do to make that learning successful. So this is an interactive session. This is a master class, so you're going to be talking. So I'd like you to turn to somebody and talk a little bit about, one, what do you see as the strengths of this kind of teaching for your particular context, either your school or your country? And then what do you see as the demands this puts on teachers? I'll give you about 5 minutes. Okay, so go ahead and find somebody. Yes. So turn to each other and talk about these two questions. One, what do you see as the value of this kind of teaching for your local school or context? And what demands does it put on teachers? What are the things that teachers would need to learn in order to do it? Okay? You're talking together? So let's hear from some of you about what you see are both some of the strengths of this and the challenges. Yes.
Some of the important growth in شو يسمونه? learning based project learning based is improving the leadership in the student.
Okay, great.
This is the great point I can see, because they are planning their project.
Yes.
And they start and at the end nobody is do nothing. All of them, they have part, they participate in, and they share it with others.
That's great. Yes, if you've planned it and supported it right, they all have that opportunity to participate and to learn. Other things?
Yes, in project-based learning, usually there is an integration between all subject areas. So the students will research using books or computers. They will have to communicate, they will have to use their 4Cs: collaboration, communication. I don't really.
You don't need to
Yes,
create, yeah.
the 4Cs. Yeah, so it's basically the most important, the integration of all subjects area.
So it offers that possibility
Yes,
to
yes.
integrate.
Yeah.
It's not always completely integrated,
Yes.
but it creates that possibility.
Yes.
And for students to see the connections,
Yes.
like why you would study all those
Yeah.
things, that's a great strength. Other, yes? So, that's a great strength that hasn't come up. The fact that because you're working on a project, you can create different roles for students. And so you can accommodate different ways of learning and support different strengths. So the student who might be really good at art could be responsible for, again, illustrating the book and helping others learn that. So it creates that opportunity for multiple competencies. Okay. How about challenges for teachers?
I just want to mention a point about the strength and then another one at the
Okay.
bottom. Guys. When we do a project-based learning and we link it to a real-world problem, students see that how they can impact the world outside the school. So it's not just them in an isolation in this classroom, it's about the entire world. You're affecting the world as a whole.
Yes.
So when we did a project about penguin with the grade 7, Miss, why do we care about penguins? We're in the desert. Well, everything you do anywhere affects those penguins. So it was kind of a shift in their thinking.
Okay. I think, again, to help young people see that they can have agency in thinking about some of the world's problems, even at a local level, and what they can do. That's a big strength.
One of the, not weaknesses, the challenges, let's say, is the fact that we're teaching English language learners, not native speakers. And the fact that just struggling to understand certain concepts or terminologies in a science classroom, let's say, or a math even, is hard enough, then let alone asking them to be completely independent in a project. So that's a big issue.
Although, again, if you have multilingual teams that are supporting each other in some of the language, they have an opportunity to use both their native language and English in working on that. But yes, certainly the differentiation is a challenge. Other challenges people see? You can see this is a group that's sold on project-based learning, so that's very great. I would say that one of the challenges for teachers is that it puts a high demand on teachers' understanding of the subject. When you are supporting a project, and kids could be doing lots of different projects, you have to think about, again, how you can draw in knowledge that supports that range of projects. So it puts demands on teachers' own and to be able to challenge them and push them. It also requires a high level of adaptive expertise. It's not routine. We can't give you a script that you could go in and follow in a project-based classroom, the way we can in some other kinds of teaching that are more direct instruction. Here you have to constantly be adjusting and adapting based on what you see that students are doing, the problems they're facing, the support that they need. So it requires that high level of adaptive expertise. And this got at it with the issue of English learners as well, you have to be focused both on the individual learning, what is the individual student learning through that project, and what is the group learning, and what is the class learning, right? It's everybody is working on something slightly different. So you need to be able to track learning on multiple levels in order to do this well. Yes, you had a question?
I also want to say that also it have a challenge of how much support the teacher should give for the students when they are applying. Like teachers need to be constantly thinking, do I need to support them now, or do I need to keep them, give them the chance to do it on their own, learn it on their own? So it's like always a reflective practice of teachers. Of how can I support these students learn it in a better way. So
yes, that is exactly one of the challenges. Too often we want to step in and solve the problem for them or give them the thing that they need. And often if we can wait and support them in other ways, they can do it themselves. So adjusting that support. Yes.
One of the important challenge can face the teachers, that's the questioning skills. It's very important if for teacher to be good in questioning skills, that she can support them and guide them.
Right.
Yeah, to let them proceed in their project.
Right. So knowing the right questions to ask that will help the students move to the next level, to help them move beyond a difficulty. Some that's just supporting the group dynamics, right, as well as the content learning. So I want to turn now to an idea that I've been developing over the last 10 years that has to do with how we help teachers develop their own practice. And we came to this idea of core practices of teaching, that you can begin to define a set of practices that are central to the work of teaching, that I think we would all agree are important to teaching, that are central to supporting student learning, that help you build more complex practice over time. And I'm going to lead this into what we see as some of the core practices for project-based learning. So there are a general set of core practices, I would argue, for teaching, more generally, and I hope you recognize these. Eliciting student thinking, okay? Providing instructional explanations, sometimes to a small group, sometimes to the large group. Facilitating productive classroom discourse. We do that in lots of different ways, but then again, something that we commonly do. Here's a classroom management one. Teaching clear routines for managing transitions, right? Do these seem familiar to you? Yeah, they should seem clear. There are also subject-specific core practices. So the ones I mentioned you would use when you're teaching any subject. But I would argue there are also practices that are specific to the particular subject that you're teaching. So for example, in math, you need to learn how to launch a math problem for students to provoke mathematical thinking. As an English teacher, I never had to do that. That wasn't something I needed to do or learn how to do. In history, you would learn how to select and prepare primary source documents for your students to learn about the making of history. In English language arts, often we're working on metacognitive strategies around reading or writing, and that might be one that travels a little bit. So there are both general practices and, I would argue, specific practices. For our
Ones that you listed,
yeah,
which one do you suggest for modern education?
I'll come back to that, okay? Yeah. This idea of core practices is actually built on a study that I did of how professionals prepared in other professions, particularly professions that were related to working with other individuals towards a common goal. So for example, in clinical psychology, they spent a lot of time teaching this practice of developing a therapeutic relationship with a client, because they found that if you had that relationship, many approaches to therapy would work. If you didn't have the relationship, nothing worked. You could just stop. So they spent a lot of time on that practice. Nursing has developed a whole set of practices that go from very technical things like managing the airway, very important for health, and invoking humor, a different side of nursing practice to make the patient comfortable. So this idea of core practices comes not just for teaching, but for other professions as well. Its use is helping us think about how should we prepare teachers? What are some of the things that we want to make sure we focus on in teacher education and professional development? The key ideas here are that practices are learnable. When I get into the practices for project-based learning, it's not I'm a project-based learning teacher or I'm not. It's a set of practices that you can learn and improve over time. They're central, again, to supporting student learning, and they are things that teachers are continuing to develop over their careers. So I do a lot of leading of classroom discussion. I even teach seminars on leading classroom discussion, but I'm still learning and improving my own ability to lead discussions. That's something that you can continue to improve. So again, take a few minutes, this time I'll only give you 2, to talk to one another and identify 2 to 3 practices that you see in your context at your school are absolutely important for a teacher to have. Okay? 2 minutes. Do you want me to go back to the other list? Will that help? So identify 2 to 3 practices. They could be leading class discussion. They could be adjusting for differentiation that you think are very important for teachers. Okay, so what are some examples of things you see in your context are very important for teachers to have? Say it again. Modeling content. Modeling is actually one of the core practices I've identified in English language arts. Modeling is a very important practice. Other examples? Say that again. Building the questioning skills of a student, okay? So helping students learn how to ask better questions, okay? A very important. Others? Yes. Assessment. Assessment is a very important core practice to be able to, and this is particularly challenging for project-based learning, as I just mentioned, but knowing how to assess learning, knowing how to see learning, making learning visible, very important practice. Okay, so I'm now going to build on that idea of core practices to talk about some of the core practices for project-based learning. What are the things that teachers need to do to help students be successful? And in this framework that we've developed at the Penn Graduate School of Education, we start with the goals. Why do we engage in project-based learning? What are the goals for students? And you see here, there are 4 central goals. First, in red, is the whole idea of content learning. Right? We still want students to develop understanding of knowledge and disciplinary practices. That's part of what they're learning in school, and it goes to project-based learning as well. But it adds the notion of learning both within and across subject matters, right? Because sometimes those projects will be interdisciplinary. Students also have to engage in roles and work that have meaning outside of the classroom. We talked about this with the notion of the penguins. The notion that you're beginning to work on things that students care about, that build that sense of ownership over learning and their own sense of agency. Another one has to do with the fact in yellow that students have to build their ability to collaborate. One of the strengths of project-based learning is it depends on collaboration. Just like you need a therapeutic relationship in therapy, you need collaboration for this to work. So students need to learn those skills. And finally, students learn something about revision, iteration, and feedback. That success happens iteratively, that you're constantly building on what you know and getting better with feedback. Related then to those 4 goals that are in the central, our team has identified this set of core practices for how do you help that happen? How do you, again, help students achieve that goal? What is it that the teacher does? And you can see in this list, for example, that related to the content, one of the things teachers always have to be doing is orienting students to the content in the project. When they're building a bridge to understand mathematics, kids can get very excited about the bridge, which is great, but you also want them to learn the mathematical and engineering principles that were part of the goal of that project. So teachers are constantly orienting the students back to the content goals. They're also helping students engage in disciplinary practices as they solve problems. How do you read primary source documents in history to build a historical argument? How do you engage in scientific inquiry if you're doing a science project? So there's a whole set of disciplinary practices that have to do with the learning of content. Then going to collaboration. One of my biggest insights, so as a high school teacher, I used a lot of groups. I would put people in groups, and sometimes they worked, and sometimes they didn't. And I couldn't understand why sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't. And I spent a long time trying to figure this out. Then I went to graduate school, and I took a course in group work with the group work guru, Elizabeth Cohen, and suddenly I understood. So there's a lot to know as a teacher about how to support collaboration, about how to create groups that are functional, about how to give people roles, about how to make sure that everybody is positioned as a competent learner in that group. And it's not that some kids dominate and some kids stay quiet. So there's a lot that teachers do to support collaboration. And I think, again, that is a particular area of practice that's important for project-based learning. Around iteration, again, as I mentioned, one of the hardest things about project-based learning is always assessing, always giving feedback that will help students move to the next level. And when you watch teachers who are good at this in action, it's amazing because they'll go up to a small group, they'll ask questions that try to figure out where the students are struggling, what the issues are, and they'll give just a little bit of feedback that helps them get reoriented, move on. It's really an incredible skill, and that's an essential skill for supporting students in project-based learning we would learn. Finally, teachers need to be able to think about how do you help students make connections between what they're learning and their own values, beliefs, and purposes. This is part of giving students agency and autonomy over their own learning and helping them see how they can make a difference in the broader world. So these are a set of practices that we would argue go above and beyond what you might already have learned to be a teacher in a more traditional classroom. And certainly these are skills that take time to develop and take feedback, again, just as students need feedback, teachers need feedback as well as they're doing this. In addition to practices, we also argue that there's some mindsets you need to be a successful project-based teacher. And many of our teachers, we did this work with teachers, and many of the teachers really argued that the mindsets were as important as the practices, that if you didn't actually believe that the goal of school is to cultivate deeper understandings rather than a lot of surface knowledge, you wouldn't really embrace project-based learning. If you didn't think that students had the competence to engage and to be successful, you would never really fully embrace project-based learning. You have to believe that students are competent, curious, and able to drive their own learning. And finally, you have to think about the teacher as a continual learner, because again, the context of class is always changing. So that there are these mindsets as well. And again, I think these are developed, that not everybody, people change their views about teaching when they see some of this happening. So let's talk a little bit about the kinds of opportunities that teachers need in order to develop their practice. Because I believe that teaching is something that you continue to get better at over time. In teacher preparation, which is my focus, you can give people a beginning set of practices, but you're always developing and learning and growing. But you can only learn these things if you have opportunities to see them. It's very hard to become a project-based learner, teacher, if you have never seen effective project-based learning. If you've never seen a teacher who's really good at it, that you're learning a lot from what I call the representations of practice. You also need to so I talked about supporting group work. That's a very broad practice. And so part of what teachers need is also the opportunity to break that down. That's very complex. And think about what are the different components of that? How do I create a good project that invites collaboration? How do I teach some of the skills of collaboration? How do I develop norms of collaboration? So part of what we would do is take a broad practice like that and break it down into the different components so that teachers have a chance to see all of the ingredients that goes into that. And finally, People learn when they get targeted feedback. When somebody comes in to see your practice and says, you were great, you gave great feedback there, but you tried to solve the problem for the students. Next time, try just stepping back a little bit, give them less feedback, and see where they go. So that kind of feedback, it's hard to get better on. I was on my own in my classroom with group work, and I would have to say I didn't really get a lot better at it because nobody came in and helped me see what was not working and how I could improve it. So we have at the Penn Graduate School of Education developed a professional learning program on project-based learning. Because as I mentioned, in the States, the pendulum is swinging back to support project-based learning. And there are a lot of schools that are embracing this. But teachers need opportunities to learn. These are mostly very experienced teachers. And some of them have had experience in project-based learning, and some of them have not. So what we do is, again, provide opportunities for them to get together and to collaborate and learn together and with each other. And in the model, to create both time in the summer for people to come together, and we spend a lot of time understanding these practices. But really, if you hear about practices, you only learn so much. You really have to do them, right? This is John Dewey famously said, there's only so much you can learn about swimming from standing on the side and demonstrating strokes. At some point, you've got to jump in the water and swim. So during the school year, the teachers are trying out these practices and videotaping them. And they send the videotapes to their coaches. And then with their group, they all look at each other's practice and see how are we getting better? What feedback can we give to each other? The final year, they come back, and this is where they develop leadership themselves to think about how do I now help other teachers learn about the things I've learned? How do I create a new initiative in my school? So the idea really is, as we were talking about earlier, is for teachers to learn together, to support one another, but around a consistent vision of what practice it will take to succeed at project-based learning. This is the academic learning cycle when they're submitting those videos and getting feedback. And again, I think part of the power of this is the teacher collaboration. Just as students have to collaborate, teachers need to collaborate and to learn from one another, to share their successes and their failures, and to engage themselves in project-based learning. So the goal of all of this is to position students as curious, capable, and creative, to really see students see themselves as ready for this faster future. To prepare teachers to spark that curiosity, to support the growth of social, emotional, and academic competence, and to encourage that creativity whenever they can. And finally, to support both teachers and students to develop into lifelong learners. So that would be the goal. And I think the challenge is how do we all get there? So let me stop there and ask for questions. Yes?
So how you get the parents involved and on board, because parents are used to textbooks.
Yes.
And when you tell them we're a textbook-less school, they're like, what? So that's the big challenge.
That's a great question. I think involves parent education as well. One of the things we've learned in previous reforms, if you leave parents out of it and they don't understand what it is their students were doing, they won't support you, right? They will undermine that reform. So when they tried to teach the new math in the United States, focusing on conceptual understanding, and the parents didn't recognize it, they worked against it. So part of it is providing parent education as well, helping them to see, bringing them in to do a project of their own and help them see why project-based learning is so engaging and motivating. So I think you're right. This is a conversation with parents as well. You also have to make learning visible, both for the students and the parents. So in the active learning effort at the university level, one of the very interesting things is in studies of this, they found that students feel that they've learned less and they're upset. The evaluations show they've learned more than their peers who were in more traditional classrooms, but they don't see it because they're not taking a test, they're doing a project. So helping, again, both the students and parents see, this is what you've learned. My son, who was in an amazing project-based learning classroom in the 5th grade, had a learning contract. And for every project, it was very clear what they would learn through that contract. And they sent the contract home to parents, and we had to sign it. So we actually saw what our son would be learning through that project. So that was a nice way of making learning visible. Other questions? Yes. Here's a mic.
It's not a question. It's just totally agree with you. As a parent, I will be happy and proud if I see what my son learned at school and he bring it back home. I can see the project that they've been working with the teacher with. So my son was in grade 5. And the teacher with the writing process, how they can write a story, imagination story.
Yeah.
So at the end, the teacher collect all the stories in one book, and they did like a celebration for this publishing the book. So still till now, my son in grade 8. He's still looking to what he did at grade 5, and I'm still proud of what he did. This kind of project, it was very, very good for him and useful because he loved reading, he loved writing.
That's a great example.
Yeah, rather than to read or to learn from one textbook.
Yes, that's a great example. Do we have time for more questions? Okay, yes. Yeah, to use the mic.
With respect to the subject-specific practices,
Yes.
where does moral education stand? Because it's something that's been introduced in UAE.
Moral education.
Yes.
So that is one where I think there are probably a set of subject-specific practices. I don't know very many people who've done too much work on that, but that is a very open field, I think, for identifying
So you mean to say that we could incorporate the ones you have mentioned?
ones you've mentioned, but also think through what are the ones that are specifically teachers would need to, again, develop in a moral education classroom.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to make a comment in regards to one of the things that His Excellency Hussein Al-Hammadi said, the minister, in this first session, in the opening session. He said that also, like, even though like we are looking towards like new strategies and new ways of teaching, we should not forget that there are some basic skills or basic knowledge that students need to memorize, need to know. So as I see, like in a project-based learning, when a teacher wants to introduce a new concept to students, they need to first introduce the knowledge that they need to understand, or the vocabs. Like they need to build something for the students first, then build on it the new learning. Yeah. So when we think about the great ideas and the big ideas like project-based learning, we should not forget the basics. And I see those like, I would say, misunderstanding of some teachers when a new project is implemented in the schools. Teachers tend to jump into like applying the project. They don't think about, okay, as a teacher I need to think about this and this and this before to be, like to help my students understand and be able to proceed. Like for example, I went into a classroom where a teacher is blaming the students for not having enough literacy skills to be able to proceed with the lesson, with the new project that is based in the schools, like using computers for learning. So I told the teacher, what about you as a teacher? Invest like 5 minutes at the beginning of each lesson and give them those basic skills. And it was like I didn't think about it. So whenever we are as teachers, as professionals, as educators, as school leaders in the schools, whenever a new project is coming to our schools, we need to keep going back to the basics of teaching. As teachers, we need to be reflective. As teachers, we need to be thinking, how can I support my students in any new project, not just like implement. Like we need to go to the basics of teaching.
So I think that's a very important point. And in most of the really successful project-based schools that we've seen, it's not either or. They're also doing mini lectures, mini lessons, opportunities to, again, learn some of the content. So that analysis of what will they learn through the project, what do they need to know to get them started, how can I assess that, I think is very much a part of it. And again, we see this as adding to the teacher's set of skills and abilities to support learning in many different modes. Good. Well, thank you all for coming today. I'm excited about this visit and what I've learned about the UAE. So thank you very much for having me here.